give it another 1 minute. Okay, so good evening, and this is our fourth and final session, and we're going to be looking at issues relating to change of heart. In the public arena, we encounter some people in very powerful positions, in commerce or in media or in politics, who take a position or use rhetoric that can potentially do us some harm. Now, we're not discussing people who openly proclaim their disdain for all Jews. We're talking instead about those who deny that they are anti-Semites. They're, after all people of polite society, and yet they say or do things or refrain from saying or doing things that undermine our interests. It could be a government official who is soft in responding to a local anti-Semitic incident, or a politician who demonizes Israel. It could be a pundit or a journalist who portrays Jews negatively, the BBC, an actor who's boycotted Israel. It could be an academic, a university chancellor who doesn't act swiftly enough to ensure that Jewish students feel safe on campus. And in many instances, these people shape, directly or indirectly, attitudes and policies that can have an impact on Jews. And it's very important, therefore, that we discuss how to deal with such figures in our efforts to outsmart anti-Semitism. And once we determine that certain people are against us, what should we do about it? And it would really help to think about this question with reference to a specific case. And let me show you these next slides. What should we do about it? So the case is as follows. In the 1950s and 1960s, France was the primary supplier of Israeli weapons, following on from the support that they provided to the Israeli underground movements before the state was declared. And before the outbreak of the Six-Day War, Israel had ordered and paid for 50 Mirage fighter jets from France. However, just before the outbreak of the hostilities, President de Gaulle of France placed an embargo on the sale of military equipment to all sides in the fighting, which only hurt Israel because the Russians supplied Egypt and Syria with arms. Observers agreed that this move was intended to boost French relations with the Arab countries that were hostile to Israel, because those relations would be more lucrative than the relations with the State of Israel. And as a result, France refused to send even the already purchased and paid for jets to Israel. And that was bad enough, but it got worse. In 1970, during the War of Attrition, President Georges Pompidou announced that France would sell Mirage jets to Libya, a sworn enemy of Israel, even as he continued the arms embargo against Israel. And here's the story as it was reported in the New York Times. And we turn to our first text tonight on page 116, Mirage jets to Libya. If somebody would care to read it, that would be great. Ruth, would you read that first, please? Just unmute first.
Yeah. After much hesitation, French officials acknowledged tonight that about 50 Mirage jet fighter planes would be sold to Libya. The confirmation of the sale was expected to provoke sharp protests from Israel. The Israelis suspect that the planes will sooner or later find their way to the fighting fronts. The French Defense Ministry reaffirmed the French embargo policy of selling no arms to the countries directly in conflict, Israel, the United Arab Republic, Jordan, and Syria, and said that they were convinced that Libya sought to supply her own forces. Israeli fears of the Libyan Mirage is based on a conviction shared by some French experts that the Libyan Air Force, in its present state, could not absorb such numbers of a highly advanced plane. The fear is compounded by the aggressive stance taken towards Israel by the new revolutionary military regime, which has been in power in Libya since early September. The plane sold to Libya is believed to be the Mirage 3, the same type as the 50 built for Israel, but placed under embargo in 1967. The Israelis are expected to find particularly galling the fact that they have been denied about the same number of planes now made available to a hostile Arab country.
Thank you. So that was an outrageous situation. And imagine that we were back in 1970. How should we react? And to sharpen the question, it is February 1970, just a few weeks after France confirmed the sale to Libya, and President Pompidou is about to make a state visit to the United States. So what should American Jews do in this situation? Well, Jews have been dealing with this type of question for a very long time. And in the first part of today's lesson, we're going to explore some Torah sources that touch on this subject. As you know, Esau sought to kill his brother, causing Jacob to flee for his life. Many years later, as the story goes, Jacob planned to return to the land of Canaan, and he sent messengers to learn of Esau's intentions. And the messengers, as you know, returned with word that Esau was marching towards him with an army of 400 men. As one might expect, Jacob prayed to God for salvation. However, as we learned in our first session, lesson number 1, we must take action to enable God's blessings to materialize. And so the Torah recounts to us the practical measures that Jacob took, summarized here by this very short midrash, which I'll read for you, and it's text number 2 on page 119. Jacob prepared himself for a three-pronged response: a prayer, a gift, and armed struggle. Here we have it on our next share screen. So, what was the nature of the gift? So the Torah recounts how Jacob sent what was for all practical purposes the currency in nomadic Canaan: goats, sheep, rams, camels, oxen, and donkeys. And he divided these into several herds and sent each one separately. And in this way, Esau would receive many gifts rather than one, and the emotional impact would be greater. And each delegation came to Esau with the word that Yaakov, Jacob, your servant, in inverted commas, seeks to mollify you and to be received graciously. And when Esau was about to arrive, Yaakov had his entire family stand respectfully to greet him, a touching scene that was intended to arouse Esau's compassion. Well, we have to assume that Jacob was likely less than thrilled that he had to deal delicately with the man who tried to kill him and who was now marching towards him menacingly, and particularly as others, possibly history, might misinterpret his efforts as a sign of weakness. Nevertheless, he engaged in this effort and prepared for war only as a last resort. It wasn't that he specifically felt weak or inferior to Esau, but he knew that he was in God's hands. But he knew as well that he had to create a kind of a natural garment through which God could conceal his blessing. And when you know that you're not in Esau's hands, but in God's hands, and your gestures are for the purpose of creating a space for God's blessings, you don't feel inferior to Esau. And as it turns out, Jacob's scheme was effective. So again, we have on text number 3 on page 119, once again, it's very short, so I should read it to you. And we learn the following, that Esau ran towards Jacob and embraced him. He fell on Jacob's neck and he kissed him and they wept. So the elaborate gift and the heart-touching scene that was orchestrated by Jacob moved Esau to embrace and to kiss him and to offer Jacob even some of his own men for protection and for support. So here is the question. Did this elaborate effort to convert Esau into a permanent ally of Jacob work? Did he become a permanent ally? Did they become completely reconciled brothers? Well, not at all. In fact, Esau may not even have been sincere when he kissed Jacob. And the sages make these points by pointing to a curious fact that the word that he kissed him, Vayishakehu, in the Torah, features little dots over the letters. And it is generally understood that when dots, in the few instances where dots hover over a Torah word, it signals a minimizing of sorts. And so there are two ways to understand this. And that is our text number 4 on page 120. And once again, it is very short, so I shall read it to you. The Torah features dots over the words, and he kissed him. And this is because Esau did not kiss Jacob wholeheartedly. Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai said, it is an established fact that Esau hates Jacob. Nevertheless, his compassion was moved at that time, and he kissed him wholeheartedly. And so the question over here, a division amongst the sages, one opinion saying that he kissed him wholeheartedly, and a second opinion saying, no, it couldn't be wholehearted because the hatred was too deep. And so let's see how this word appears in the Torah in our next screens. So that's the Torah text. And there's the word Vayishakehu, the little dots on top, as you see. Question is whether it is temporary, genuine love, or whether it is feigned love. So on the one hand, Esau's behavior prior to the hug and kiss was quite menacing, leading some to believe that therefore he didn't kiss Jacob with a full heart. On the other hand, Jacob worked really hard to arouse Esau's compassion, so perhaps during those moments he felt true love and he kissed Jacob wholeheartedly. You see, human emotions are very complicated. Haters themselves don't always understand the exact nature of their feelings, and outside observers certainly can't be sure. But either way, according to all opinions, we know that Esau didn't turn out to be a friend or an ally long term. The dots on the word tell us that he either feigned love for a moment or he felt genuine love, but only for a moment. And yet the Torah's narrative seems to suggest that the ambiguity and short lifespan of Esau's love doesn't minimize the success of the story. Jacob didn't need Esau to be transformed, and neither did he expect this. He got what he needed. No matter what Esau was feeling, the fact is that rather than attack Jacob, Esau kissed him, and he allowed Jacob to proceed in peace. And that counts as a success. So on the assumption that one reason why this story was recorded in the Torah was to guide us in our dealings with problematic Gentiles and anti-Semites, as we see in our next text from Nachmanides, What lessons does this episode provide the Jewish people in terms of dealing with our enemies? And this is text number 5 on page 12, for which we'll need a reader, please. Anyone?
I'll do it.
Thank you.
The Midrash relates, Bereshit Rabbah, that when Rabbi Yanai would set out for a meeting with the Roman government, he would first read this passage in the Torah regarding Jacob and Esau. The sages had a tradition that this passage was a guide for our exile. Therefore, when Rabbi Yanai would visit the rulers of Rome for communal issues, he would consult this passage to follow the advice of the wise Jacob. It is indeed appropriate for all generations to study his approach and to adopt it in actual practice.
And here we have it. That's the point we're going to be trying to make tonight as we continue. So, like Rabbi Yanai, one central idea that Jews throughout the ages gleaned from the Jacob-Esau story was that they could and they should influence the negativity of the Esavs of their generations. That a problematic Gentile was not someone who had to be fought with, nor was it necessary to cut off all ties with him. Although Jacob prepared to fight, he tried to avoid this at all costs. And the thought was that rather than antagonizing anti-Semitic Gentiles, one should find effective ways to influence them, even if it meant uncomfortably expressing kind words or giving them gifts. And there are a number of historical examples of this. One very noteworthy example is a story recorded in the Talmud about Rabbi Shimon. This, by the way, is the same sage who we've just read believed that it is an established fact that Esau hates Jacob. Rabbi Shimon, by the way, wasn't only talking about the person of Esau. He was talking about the Roman Empire, the time in which he lived, a very, very difficult time, which our sages perceived as being the heirs of Esau. So Rabbi Shimon lived in Israel in the 2nd century. Israel was occupied by the Romans, and he suffered extensively at their hands. In a very well-known episode, by the way, he said to a few fellow rabbis that Rome's policies were motivated by self-interest. And he was overheard, and somebody went and told the authorities of this, and they dispatched soldiers to arrest him. And he was forced to hide in a cave for 13 years to elude capture. So for him, the statement about Gentiles wasn't just theory. It was something which he experienced at first hand. Text number 6 on page 122. Once again, it is very short. The Roman government once issued a decree that Jews may not observe Shabbat, circumcision, and family purity. The Jews said to themselves, "Who should go to Rome to solicit annulment of the decree? Let Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai go, for he is experienced in miracles." So Rabbi Shimon, the same man who has suffered at the hands of these tyrants, the one who firmly believes that there is an immutable law, that the anti-Semite will never be erased, that it is a law that Esau hates Jacob, accepts this task. And he traveled to Rome, and he made a positive impression on the emperor, and the emperor allowed for an annulment of the decree. So we'd perfectly well understand if he had refused to go to Rome. After all, what use could there be? And yet he went, because Jacob's experience had taught him that there's no contradiction. I can believe that you don't like me, and I can still believe that you'll give me what I need. In fact, I might even get a kiss from you, perhaps even one that is wholehearted for a few minutes. And as a matter of fact, this model continued to be followed throughout most of Jewish history. In Europe, there were influential court Jews who used their connections to intercede on behalf of their fellow Jews. They were called Shtadlanim, or advocates, Shtad from, I suppose, from city. And in figure 4.1 on page 123, you can see a chart of Jewish advocates in Central Europe between 1500 and 1800. We're not going to go through it, but it is there for you to see. We're going to talk about one of the most famous and most successful Shtadlanim. His name was Yosef of Rosheim. He lived from 1480 to 1554. And he advocated on behalf of German Jews in the courts of the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I, and later his grandson Charles V. Now let's be clear, these two rulers were definitely not Jew lovers. Charles V was a grandson, through his mother, of King Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, who infamously expelled the Jews from Spain in 1492. And yet Yosef of Rosheim visits their courts on many occasions and manages to procure privileges for German Jews and to protect them against oppression and expulsion. He wrote his memoirs, and we have in text number 7 on page 124 an example from his memoirs. If somebody would like to read it, that would be great, please, a volunteer. Anyone? Doris, thank you.
Okay. In 1531, the denouncers once again hounded the Emperor, Charles V, while he was in Belgium and Holland, lands uninhabited by Jews. Many requested that I travel to those lands to oppose the accusers with the help of God. I was at the court of the exalted Emperor for 4 months, from the 1st of Adar until the 1st of Shivan, pursuing the interests of the Jewish communities. Although Rothroyd attempted to swallow me alive and to bring about my demise, God in his great mercy sent his messenger and saved me from his hands and from all those who sought to harm me. At that time, I had an audience with the Emperor in his private chamber. I spoke to him for as long as I needed, and he responded sympathetically. During this period, when I had free time and was secluded in my room, I authored a book entitled The Sanctified Path.
So there we are. His account is not comprehensive. We don't know who this person Rothroyd is, but we don't know the full story. But what we can glean from this memoir is that he puts himself at tremendous risk to help his fellow Jews. He leaves his home for 4 months. He has a lot of time alone during those 4 months because Jews weren't allowed to live in those regions. And there were enemies lurking everywhere. So he's forced to stay in his quarters. And he chose to author a work on Jewish ethics, which has not survived. It's quoted twice in another book written about that time, but we don't actually have the book itself. But our point over here is that Yosef of Rosheim doesn't believe for a moment that the grandson of Ferdinand and Isabella is a lover of Jews. In fact, Charles V was also the King of Spain, which means that he was presiding over the Inquisition that at that time was busy burning those accused of practicing Judaism in secret. But you see, Yosef wasn't looking to bestow an honor on a righteous Gentile, on Charles, nor was he looking to change him. He had a very specific goal: to ensure that the German Jewish community would survive. And as such, he manages to visit Charles and to convince him to reject those at court who were denouncing Jews. Now, we don't know what Yosef said to Charles or what he promised him. It would really be very fascinating to know that. But whatever the case, Yosef got the concession that he needed. He learned from Jacob that we can hope to get help even from our enemies. Now, of course, this model doesn't always work. Jewish history is replete with failures alongside many successes. And one very famous failure is depicted by an artist, Emilia Sala Francis, 1850 to 1910, in a painting which is housed in the Prado Museum in Madrid. Now you can see this in figure 4.2 on page 126, but you can also see this in the slide that we're going to show you. Sorry, I missed out on these slides. There we are. That's the slide. So when Ferdinand and Isabella decreed the expulsion of all Jews from Spain, a very famous Jew called Don Isaac Abarbanel, who was a very wealthy Jewish scholar, a very great scholar, managed to secure 3 separate audiences with the king, during which he and some non-Jewish allies that the Abarbanel managed to get on his side tried to persuade the monarch to rescind the decree. And he had also, by the way, offered a vast sum of gold in return for the decree's annulment. And this picture, which I think you can see, yes, thumbs up, you can see, you've got this on your screens, okay? So this painting depicts a very interesting legend that while the Abarbanel, or perhaps another Jew whose back is to us, was trying to convince the king and the queen, the infamous chief inquisitor, Toma de Torquemada, burst into the room and he yelled, "Judas sold him for 30 pieces of silver. Now you want to sell him again?" And in this painting, Abarbanel, with his back towards us, watches as his diplomatic efforts begin to unravel. The Abarbanel, by the way, does not include this in his own account, and he seems to suggest that the reason why the king didn't listen to him was not because of Torquemada, but because of the influence of Isabella. So there were times when the Stadtland worked, and there were times when it didn't. And in fact, there were many haters like Yosef who could be worked with, but of course there were some like Haman, Torquemada, Hitler, from whom no concessions could ever be expected. But we have to say that the approach was effective on many occasions. Now, the point is this, you see, some people feel very queasy about this approach because it looked like the Jews were begging. And so much so that the more muscular attitude that developed with an independent Israel and a strong army disdained what they considered to be a galut mentality, a galut attitude of obeisance to our enemies. But did Jacob or Rabbi Shimon or Yosef of Rosheim or Barbanel feel that they were begging? They knew that the Jewish future depended on God's blessing, not on the explicit mention of divine assistance. Note the mention of divine assistance in the story of Rabbi Shimon. He is accustomed to miracles, which is why he was sent. And in Yosef of Rosheim's account, to oppose the accusers with the help of God. Their job in their eyes was merely to generate the garment through which God's blessings could be expressed. Just show you these next 2 slides. Are we puppets on a string? Or are we recognizing that we're in God's hands and then you don't feel inferior? So we have claimed now that Jews assumed that they could gain good things even from those who disliked them. And we've mentioned a few examples that demonstrate the truth of this claim. But we have to explain still how this makes sense. Didn't the person hate them? Why would he do the Jews any favors? Here's the question. Where did the hate go? How were we able to change their minds, even if it wasn't sincere, or even if it wasn't for long term? What changes in a person that allows them to make concessions that they themselves didn't believe they were going to make? So we're coming back to Pompidou, by the way, because we asked the question, what would you do, in that situation when Pompidou visits America? How would you want to react? That's what we're building up to. But here's another story. On July the 28th, and many of you will remember this, in 2006, the actor Mel Gibson was pulled over for speeding in Malibu, California. And Gibson failed a breathalyzer test, but he refused arrest. and he had to be handcuffed and forced into the squad car. And he asked the officer, James Mee, if he was Jewish. And when he learned that he was, he directed at him anti-Semitic slurs and curses. And this was the context in which Gibson shouted, "Jews are responsible for all the wars in the world." And the news media at the time was all over the story. And Gibson later offered an apology, and he asked that people should realize that he's not a bigot and not an anti-Semite. So some of the commentators asserted that this story revealed that Gibson was an anti-Semite. It was just that until then, he had kept his views to himself, and that under the influence of alcohol, the truth was out. And others were more forgiving. Gibson's Jewish friend, Dean Devlin, stated publicly that he spends a lot of time with Gibson and that he's not an anti-Semite, and that Gibson's remarks were a result of alcohol abuse, and it said nothing about the man himself. So a neuroscientist called David Eagleman jumps into this whole argument, and he suggests that trying to determine the true Mel Gibson is misguided. So here are texts 8a and 8b on page 128 and 129, in which David Eagleman makes his case. Would somebody please volunteer to read this? Karen?
Which page that was?
It's page 128, 128. Text 8a and text 8b.
Right. Cognitive diversity. Brains are like representative democracies. They are built of multiple overlapping experts who weigh in and compete over different choices. There is an ongoing conversation among the different factions in your brain, each competing to control the single output channel of your behavior. When the hostess at a party offers a chocolate cake, you find yourself on the horns of a dilemma. Some parts of your brain have evolved to crave the rich energy source of the sugar, and other parts care about the negative consequences, such as the health of your heart. Part of you wants the cake, and part of you tries to muster the fortitude to forego it. The final vote of the parliament determines which party controls your action. That is whether you put your hand up, or out. As the French essayist Michael de Montaigne put it, there is much difference between us and ourselves as there is between us and others.
And that brings us back to Mel Gibson in text 8b. Please continue.
Team of rivals. Returning to Mel Gibson and his drunken tirade, we can ask whether there is such a thing as true colors. We have seen that behavior is the outcome of the battle among internal systems. To be clear, I'm not defending Gibson's despicable behavior, but I'm saying that a team of rivals' brain can naturally harbor both racist and non-racist feelings. Alcohol is not a truth serum. Instead, it tends to tip the battle towards the short-term, unreflective faction, which has no more or less claim than any other faction to be the true one.
So that's a very fascinating insight over there, because we're used to dividing people into very neat categories: anti-Semite, righteous Gentile, with us, against us, etc. But the human brain isn't unidimensional. There are many different systems operating within it, as we've just read. And the same person can have multiple contradictory feelings on a given subject. And under certain conditions, an anti-Semitic perspective can gain the upper hand within someone and dominate his actions, just as an anti-Semitic party can arise in a country and take control of its government. But remember that that country under those circumstances still has individuals and parties that are not anti-Semitic. And in just the same way the anti-Semite has parts of his personality not dominating now that are not anti-Semitic. And this is one reason why people can behave in contradictory ways in terms of their relationships with Jews or any other subject. As the poet Walt Whitman wrote, "Do I contradict myself? Very well then, I contradict myself. I am large. I contain multitudes." So let's take a look at these next slides. So this could perhaps explain to us how Rabbi Shimon could say, on the one hand, that it's an established fact that Esau hates Jacob, and yet he could still maintain that Esau kissed Jacob wholeheartedly. That was his opinion. Rabbi Shimon didn't intend to say that every cell in Esau's brain hated Jacob. He merely said that this hate was there, perhaps even prominently, but not necessarily omnipresent. And accordingly, it need not always express itself. It really depends very largely on the conditions. Certain conditions will bring out Esau's anti-Semitism, while others will put it aside. So Jacob managed to generate those conditions that moved Esau's hate to the cognitive back burner. And the same applies to many of the anti-Semites that Jews have had to deal with throughout the ages. Jewish leaders sought to create the right circumstances to help a different subset of voices to rise to power within those people. And sometimes they don't want to show their hate in the open, either because it's unbecoming or for some other reason. So let's come back to Pompidou. What does this mean for us today? Well, look, we live in a very different world from our ancestors. Our ancestors didn't really have a choice between gifts and war. Usually their only course of action was gifts. What, after all, was Yosef of Rosheim's options? Could he have gained anything by pounding his fists on the table in a threatening manner? Could he have arranged a mass demonstration outside the palace? But for us today, most Jews live in democracies where there's freedom of speech. And as a result, Jews can engage in wars of words, attacking those who we regard our enemies. And if they are politicians, we can join the political fight against them. If they are celebrities or journalists, we can boycott their appearances and their writings. We can use social media accounts to call out anti-Semitic transgressions, acts either of commission or of omission. We can try to cancel haters and shame them into silence and isolation. And that is why today many Jews look down on the Shtadlanim and their approach, and why court Jews, certainly in Israel, became a term of contempt. And these new powers that were the ones that were in evidence when the French president, Mr. Pompidou, came to the United States in 1970 after he reneged on the Mirage sale to Israel. And he was met with fierce demonstrations. Here is the New York Times report from that time in text number 9 on page 131. If somebody would kindly read it for us, please.
I'll read it.
Thank you.
The angry president. President Nixon made a hurried trip to New York yesterday to apologize to President Pompidou, who was angered by what he termed insults to himself and his wife during pro-Israeli demonstrations touched off by his state visit to the United States. The French president had been angered by a jostling that members of his party received from demonstrators in Chicago, whose actions were marked by boos and angry cries, and what he viewed as an acceptable of such hostile acts by the Chicago police.
So there you are, you see, unlike our ancestors, we can go to war. But here's the question, should we? Remember that Jacob legitimately had the option of war, but he chose the other route. Now, the Lubavitcher Rebbe in his lifetime was extremely controversial on this whole subject. And he very strongly argued that public outcry and mass demonstrations against the French president on that occasion might have been well-intentioned, but they were misguided. I'm going to just show you these slides and then read the next text. Let's unpack some of this here. So, text number 10a on page 132. Shall I read it? This is from the Lubavitcher Rebbe. The public protests against the president of France angered French officials. This blocked any lobbying efforts that French Jews might have been able to make to prevent or at least reduce French assistance to Arab countries that are hostile to Israel. The stated reason for these protests was to demonstrate that America is a democratic country and that American Jews are not cowardly. And this is a worthwhile objective when Jewish lives are not at risk. However, when Jews are threatened with the sale of many military jets to Libya, we have two options. We can organize public protests, or we can make every effort to either prevent or postpone the sale, reduce the number of jets sold, or to at least prevail upon the French to send less effective planes. And such aims can only be achieved through quiet diplomacy. The proof is that agreements of this nature have been reached in the past. Now, the Rebbe in this instance didn't clarify what he meant about past agreements, but a year later, in another talk, in text number 10b on page 134, he said the following, and I shall continue to read it. Referring back to the year before when Pompidou visited the United States. When Mr. Pompidou visited the United States, there were mass protests against him intended to intimidate France. The effort backfired. It can now be said that despite the French embargo against selling arms to the belligerents in the Middle East, the French president had allowed the sale of small arms and light weapons to Israel, items that can be sold without attracting publicity. However, as a result of the demonstrations, the approval for such sales was withdrawn. After some time, when he was no longer being disparaged, he resumed dealing with Jews behind closed doors and reinstated the small arms sales. He also arranged for 300 Jews to be able to leave Egypt. All of this was accomplished without demonstrations and without publicity. The Jewish media was warned against disclosing any of this, and we only know of this from the non-Jewish press. The conclusion we must draw from this case is that that we do not influence anti-Semites by constantly yelling at them. Yelling at them, you are an anti-Semite, you are a thief, you are a murderer. Rather, engage with them in diplomatic conversation. Although such individuals are well aware of what we think of them, they're nevertheless human beings, and they wish to behave like human beings. Well, that was a very controversial approach at the time, and possibly continues to be so. But that is the argument that we're trying to make tonight in this last course over here. Because in this specific example, we see the age-old approach of working behind the scenes to minimize harm and to gain benefits that has continued to be effective even in the modern era. And here is another example of this approach, a fascinating one, in which we'll see a more enduring transformation. And once again, it is taken from America. Mr. Jesse Helms from North Carolina was elected to the United States Senate in 1972. For more than a decade, he voted consistently against the interests of Israel. For example, he voted against all foreign aid to Israel. In 1982, after Israel invaded Lebanon, he suggested that the United States break off relations with Israel. And many pro-Israel groups were hugely angered by Helms, and they tried to unseat him. In 1984, Chabad held an event in Washington, D.C. to celebrate the fact that President Reagan and both houses of Congress designated the Lubavitch Rebbe's 82nd birthday as Education Day USA. And the purpose of this designation was to promote the Rebbe's campaign to upgrade the ethical and the moral foundation of education in American public schools, not Jewish schools, but for the whole of the American public. Among the many high-profile attendees at this particular event was Senator Jesse Helms. And when Harvard professor Alan Dershowitz read about this, he wrote to the Rebbe, objecting to Lubavitch Chabad honoring Jesse Helms. And the Rebbe replied to him, and all of this correspondence has been made public not by the Rebbe himself or by his secretariat, but by Alan Dershowitz for reasons that we'll see shortly. The Rebbe replied that the event did not honor Senator Helms, but to the contrary, Senator Helms came to honor and pay tribute to Chabad's commitment to education. And the Rebbe then added a very interesting postscript to the letter, and that is text number 11 on page 136. I trust you will agree that in regard to the persons of influence, whether in Washington or elsewhere, the first objective should be to persuade and encourage such a person to use his influence in a positive way in behalf of any and all good causes which are important to us. We should welcome every public appearance which lends public support to the cause, especially when there's a likelihood that it may be a forerunner of similar pronouncements in the future. My experience with such people, although I've never personally met the said person, has convinced me that politicians are generally motivated more by expediency than by conviction. In other words, their public pronouncements on various issues do not stem from categorical principles or from religious imperatives. Hence, most of them, if not all, are subject to change in their positions, depending on time, place, and other factors. I believe, therefore, that the proper approach to such persons by Jewish leaders should not be rigid. As a rule, it does no good to engage in a cold war, which may often turn into hot war, nor does it serve any useful purpose to brand one as an enemy or as an anti-Semite, however tempting it is to do so, even if that person vehemently denies it. It can only be counterproductive. On the contrary, ways and means should be found to persuade such a person to take a favorable stance, at least publicly. We haven't too many friends, and attaching labels, etc., are not going to gain us any. Instances abound where the approach advocated above produced good results. And there's surely no need to point out to you that responsible Jewish leaders consistently cultivate good public relations, indeed even cordial relations, with President Carter and his predecessors going back to President Roosevelt, regardless of their sometimes openly negative feelings towards Jews and Jewish causes. So when Professor Dershowitz recounted this story, he added a postscript of his own. Sure enough, after he was honored, Senator Helms assumed a very influential role on the United States Senate Foreign Relations Committee and became one of the strongest supporters of Israel and other Jewish causes as well. So obviously the Rebbe had enormous influence on persuading Jesse Helms that even with his very conservative values, he could become a beacon for the Jewish people and the Jewish state. That's what Professor Dershowitz said. Well, we can't precisely know why Senator Helms changed his stance on Israel. And there is an interesting suggestion that he changed his mind because he felt that Israel would, if not supporting Israel, America, if not supporting Israel, would have had to station an aircraft carrier in the region, which would have been much more expensive. And he also became a strong proponent of Israeli control over Judea and Samaria that he had previously opposed. But Professor Dershowitz may be right that this event might have had some influence on Helm, but in the final analysis, it actually doesn't matter. The reason why he changed his stance is less significant than the fact that he did. And the Rebbe was a realist. He understood politicians. He understood that they went the way that worked at that particular moment. So the fact of the matter is that we can get important things even from those who dislike us if we approach them in a sensible way. But that's only going to work if we don't label people as our enemies and engage them in open warfare. And it may not work all the time, but it can work a lot of the time. Of course, once again, we're not talking here tonight about hardcore anti-Semites on the far right or on the far left. We've spoken about them in the past. These are people you're not going to be able to do business with. The best thing to do with them is to realize that the problem is there with them, not with us, and therefore we don't have to change ourselves in order to be able to accommodate their views. We looked at that before. We're talking about those people we mentioned at the very outset, the journalists, the chancellors of universities, the lecturers, the politicians, people who have said nasty things about Jews, about Israel, but you might be able to do business with them. So where does that leave us? We've spoken many times in these courses about the goal of Jewish history, which is to realize the era of Mashiach, a world in which there's no hatred whatsoever. That, of course, was Isaiah's prophecy, that there won't be hatred, that the wolf will lie with the lamb, which was a parable for the relationships between Jews and non-Jews. But the reality is that until the Mashiach comes, it's not practical to suppose that all hatred is going to be eradicated. So how do we operate within this imperfect reality? And here, I suppose, is the suggestion. Let's share this next screen. Perhaps to be slower to name and shame, and quicker to engage and influence. And you see, it's just drops of water on a little plant. And maybe we can grow the plant if we're clever, if we go about it in the right way. In many circumstances, we can work with people to get good results, whether these people oppose us or support us. If we try but fail, then of course we still have the ability to go to war through public labeling and shaming, and that might be a valid option. Not to say that it's not an option ever, but we should, at the very least, we should try gift giving, our best effort, and not to feel belittled or powerless with this approach, because we know that no one has control over us, that ultimately we're in God's hands, and that any effort that we're making is just to create the circumstances in which the Almighty's blessings can be with us. And this is relevant to community leaders, all community leaders, and to their advisors. But they won't be able to work this model if they feel the pressure, the grassroots pressure from the Jewish community to yell and disparage rather than to try diplomatic efforts. And that's why this is a message that's important, not just for the influencers, but for all of us, because the influencers are the ones who are influenced in turn by us. Just next couple of slides. What does this mean? We all of us have that person at work or in some other context who we deem to be an anti-Semite. Many have that neighbor who they decided a long time ago was a Jew hater because of something he said or didn't say, or she said or didn't say. And it's very likely then that knowingly or unknowingly, these Jews have let their feelings be known, which only exasperates the problem, and it leads to that kind of Cold War. And our message today is that in all of our engagements, when we come across these people, we shouldn't be so quick to render verdicts. Just because someone hates you doesn't mean that you can only experience hate from that person. If you set the stage properly, you can have possibly positive experiences from that person as well. And there's another very important lesson that emerges from this. Given the discussion about the complexity of the human brain and the conflicts that it contains, the converse lesson is also important, that we should not assume that someone who acted in the past like a Philo-Semite is going to be an eternal blood friend. Even among those who have helped and defended Jews, certainly under certain circumstances, they too can flip the other way. And just because somebody said nice things about Jews doesn't mean that we can always rely upon them or her to be for us, to be there for us in the future. The Talmud has a wonderful expression, kabdehu v'chashdehu. It rhymes. Kabdeh from the word kavod, give them honor, v'chashdehu from choshed, and suspect them. Honor and suspect at the same time. Because ultimately we know as Jews that we can only put our trust in God. Last week, we argued that a deeply embedded Jewish education underpinning our political knowledge about Israel and our political arguments about Israel is one of the ways to ensure that more young Jews will have a positive attitude towards Israel. In a similar way, an educational system focused on developing good character traits as well as imparting knowledge, because that's what education does, is one of the ways of creating a society with less hatred and creating the conditions to bring out the good in people. And that doesn't negate teaching maths or science or languages or philosophy. On the contrary, the study of these disciplines, if taught together with values and together with a sense of purpose, is what's going to create young people who grow up to do good in later life. So in a sense, in the story about anti-Semitism, we need to be able to dig much deeper down to the educational system in our countries that begins to develop attitudes amongst young people, teaching them values of goodness, of kindness, of giving, and of tolerance, in the absence of hate. That is where it begins. When they become adults, it's much, much more difficult to work with them. And that is the theme of the concluding video for this particular series, which we're going to turn to now.
Negative thoughts, actions, and speech create negative energy. Conversely, positive thoughts, actions, and speech create positive energy. And that's what led, with an idea that has its genesis in South Africa, to the idea of ARC, acts of random kindness. You see, this is kind of shaped a little bit, more or less, if you use your imagination, like Noah's Ark. And the idea is you take some change, you place it in here, and when it's filled up, we pass it along to someone who's less fortunate. It isn't just the money collected, it's the thought and the feeling that it represents.
So I went to a public school. I studied math and physics, and we studied how to solve math problems. I didn't know how to solve my own problems.
Rabbi David Aaron, a Jerusalem-based educator, reflects on his personal experience.
The real problems of life is what education should be focusing on. It's essentially about building people, and only great people will do great things.
It is my distinct honor and pleasure to welcome the 40th President of the United States, Ronald Wilson Reagan. Mr. President.
On March 30, 1981, then President of the United States, Ronald Reagan, delivered a luncheon address at the Washington Hilton.
Thank you very much.
He left the hotel at 2:27 p.m., but as he headed to his limousine, a would-be assassin opened fire. Reagan was critically wounded, and the nation collectively gasped in horror. The president survived, and at a public gathering 2 weeks later, the Lubavitcher Rebbe insisted that the instructive lesson of the assassination attempt must similarly survive. The Rebbe saw the event as a wake-up call for the nation to upgrade its approach to education.
In der Beis Sefer meyusod und durchgenommen. Was darf geben, a Beis Sefer darf geben Jidit. Nicht darf Eisfurmen, Buftor, Bufmachen, dem Jeser Leben Odom, als soll sein mit Midis Davis. Und soll wissen, als stark, als geht und lernt in dem Beis Sefer. Aber der Riker lernen seine Ries. Was sie zum Ton Teva rumsich und das ist der Teva Amiti für sich. Und das ist im ganzen Niterei in der Tochnis und in der Programm von Besefer.
As much as we want to graduate mathematicians and scientists, we also want to graduate decent human beings.
Dr. Rona Novick, Dean of the Israeli Graduate School of Jewish Education and Administration, has given ample thought to this problem.
Very few educators would invite a charismatic speaker or have a big assembly program to create readers. They would understand that the way that we build reading skills is piece by piece and building block by building block. We start in kindergarten and first grade and we keep building on it. Well, we need to look at character education and social emotional learning in exactly the same way.
Judaism teaches us that it's important to give charity every day. And the more you give charity, that muscle of kindness within you gets stronger and stronger.
Rabbi Levi Greenberg and his wife Shana are emissaries of the Lubavitcher Rebbe in El Paso, Texas.
We embarked on a campaign to bring this message of daily giving to every single child in El Paso. And so we brought to El Paso the ARC campaign. All the children in the school received one of these boxes, and they were told that the purpose of this box is to be taken home and filled every day. If they have extra coins, they should ask their parents for some money. After a month of collecting money, their class would nominate charities that should receive their combined money. And the winning charity would receive the combined monies that they had collected throughout that month. The ARC project, giving money every day, takes acts of random kindness and turns them into acts of routine kindness.
Raising a generation of individuals empowered with a sense of purpose and trained to pursue acts of kindness is an important factor in curing and preventing numerous social ills, including the reduction of hate and bigotry, along with anti-Semitism.
The more we give, the more we respect. We respect human life, we respect property, the more dignity we have for ourselves and for society. If we want to stop anti-Semitism, we have to stop hatred. And we have the opportunity to nip hatred in the bud by increasing in acts of goodness and kindness and inspiring and encouraging all of humanity to do so. every single person should give charity every day, and hatred will be a thing of the past.
The call of the hour, more necessary than ever, is for each of us to adopt a charity box for regular daily contributions and to encourage all around us, family and friend, Jew and non-Jew, to act similarly. Actively demonstrate, encourage, and promote kindness, sympathy, and altruistic care. If a little illumination eliminates a lot of darkness, think of what a rapidly swelling force of systematic goodness can achieve for our communities and ultimately for humanity. It's time to turn up the light.
Sorry. Let's take it back to the beginning again. So, let me just stop the share. And find my notes, which have also been lost. Okay. Today's lesson was about how we relate to and interact with non-Jews, even Jew haters. And that therefore should spur us to ask, how do we relate to each other within the Jewish community? And we need, before we finish this course, just take a look at that as well. And once again, the story of Purim is instructive. Haman's accusation was that there was a disunified people scattered throughout the 127 provinces. And as such, they were unable to listen to their leaders or to develop a cohesive strategy. Mordechai's antidote to the calumny was to unite the people and to encourage them to show mutual love. But you may be wondering, while Jewish unity is a wonderful ideal, what connection does it have to this course? And the answer is, it's about the way in which we interrelate with each other within the Jewish community. And if we're strong in ourselves and we're united in ourselves, we have a common front to be able to connect against and to stand against those who hate us. When we bicker amongst ourselves, we're unable to present our enemy with the united front. We're weaker in our response to anti-Semitism, and this in itself can encourage anti-Semites to put their nefarious plans into action. Anti-Semitism is something that we must contend with to reduce it, to manage it, but ultimately the matter's out of our hands because other people have free choice despite what we would like them to do. The one thing that we can control is how we interact with each other. And that is why the close of this particular course is a message of Jewish unity, because Jewish solidarity will empower us to face anti-Semitism. So we're going to just show the video summary, and then we're going to do the takeaways of what we've learned in the past 4 sessions. So let's go back over here and move to our video summary in the usual way.
Lesson 4, Change of Heart. 1. The Torah's narrative of Jacob and Esau suggests that by employing the right words and deeds, we can influence those we deem to be against us. Accordingly, the 2nd century sage Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai traveled to Rome to win concessions for the benefit of the Jewish community, establishing a model followed by countless others, most famously the European court Jews of the early modern period. 2. Jews did not feel inferior while conducting diplomatic missions. They knew that the Jewish future depended on God, and that their job was to generate a garment behind which God could conceal his blessings. A firm belief that they were in God's hands inspired in them a sense of pride. 3. According to modern neuroscience, brains are built of multiple parts that weigh in concerning different choices, each part competing to control the single output channel of behavior. This explains why an individual with Jewish friends can nevertheless carry out a drunken tirade against Jews. Conversely, it explains why Jews can gain assistance from unlikely sources. 4. Today, we are finally able to campaign publicly against those who oppose us. However, it is often counterproductive to publicly brand individuals as enemies or anti-Semites. Slow to shame and quick to engage is still an effective route. 5. We must do everything possible to condition society to bring out the best in people rather than their more sinister elements. In the sphere of education, this means promoting an approach that is not restricted to acquiring information, but rather includes proper character traits, self-discipline, and the awareness that all humans are created to actively generate goodness in their environments. 6. Living in harmony with our fellow Jews enables us to better collaborate to ward off threats and promote our interests. Jewish mysticism teaches that God responds positively to Jewish unity, providing overt blessings of protection and goodness.
Okay, here are the takeaways of what we discussed in our 4 lessons. Lesson number 1. Don't allow ourselves to become overly anxious about anti-Semitism to the point where we lose our ability to think clearly. Create the natural means through which God can provide his protection and security. Lesson number 2. Anti-Semitism is not a fault in us, it is a fault in the hater. And therefore don't internalize it and don't change your behavior to accommodate the haters. Being open about Jewish identity benefits Jews, but it also fosters an acceptance of diversity for others. Many people have an inner void in their lives. By example and friendship, Jews can help them to fill that void with positive purpose. Lesson number 3, the way to help more young Jews to feel positive about Israel is to give them a rounded Jewish education in which the centrality of the land of Israel is fully understood as our heritage. This does not minimize the importance of educating them in how to respond to the political and anti-Zionist arguments relating to the state of Israel and its policies. The Jewish religion is tied to the land of Israel because it is the place in which our spiritual values can be implemented in this physical world, and it is the place where the spiritual and the physical coalesce. And lesson number 4, not all anti-Semites are hardcore and irredeemable. Avoid labels and public shaming. Work with even those who are against us if it can produce beneficial results. And that therefore brings us to the end of our course. But for the fact that I'd like to show you, before we close tonight, a little trailer of our next course, which is coming up. Here we are.
Lesson 4.
Sorry.
Change of heart.
I've got to move ahead of this.
1.
You can't see it. We're not seeing it.
You're not seeing it? Oh, sorry, okay. Sorry, thanks. I seem to have lost my Zoom over here. Here we are, sorry. Okay, sorry. I'm back again. So let me just, which part, what did you not see? Did you see the, you didn't see any of the last video, the video of the, of this summary of this course? You saw that or not?
No.
You saw that, okay. All right. So let's come back now to this one over here. and go back to the beginning of it. Normally they show the trailer for the next movie before you see the main show, but tonight we showed it at the end. All right, everyone. Let me just stop the recording now.